The storm did not begin in the sky. It began in silence, in the kind of silence that grows inside a man when suspicion becomes more comforting than trust. For weeks, Nick had been moving through Genoa City like someone whose shadow had stopped belonging to him. He smiled when expected, spoke when necessary, showed up where he had to, but underneath that polished restraint, something far darker had taken hold. He had started watching Riza not because he cared about her, and not even because he hated her, but because she had become the one loose thread attached to Adam's newest illusion of control. Adam always had a way of building himself back up from ashes that should have buried him for good, always had a way of looking wounded while quietly arranging the next move that would leave everyone else bleeding. Nick had seen that pattern too many times to dismiss the instinct gnawing at him now. Riza was too careful in daylight and too restless at night. She moved like a woman carrying a secret heavy enough to change the balance of several lives, and Nick, once he sensed it, could no longer walk away from it. He followed her from a distance through rain-slick streets and empty parking structures, watched her leave lights on in rooms she was not in, watched her change routes for no obvious reason, watched her step outside just after midnight, with a phone clutched in her hand and a face that looked nothing like the one she wore around Adam. What turned Nick from observer into predator was not a single act, but the accumulation of details that refused to fit into any harmless explanation. Riza met no one in public, yet she was always in contact with someone. She deleted messages almost the moment they arrived. She once stood beneath a street lamp in the dead of night, soaked in thin silver rain, and listened more than she spoke, nodding to a voice only she could hear, as if receiving instructions rather than comfort. Nick stayed hidden and watched the whole thing through a windshield fogged by his own breath, his hands locked so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles whitened. In that instant, he did not see her as a frightened woman caught in something dangerous. He saw her as proof that Adam had once again built a private world of lies while the rest of them were left to deal with the fallout. Nick had spent too much of his life cleaning up after Adam's moral collapses, too much of his emotional strength absorbing betrayals that never arrived as open attacks, but as hidden detonations. The rage in him was no longer dramatic. It was quiet, cold, procedural. That made it more dangerous than any shouting fit could ever be. By the time the storm rolled over Genoa City, Nick had already made his decision. He told himself it was not about vengeance, even though vengeance was woven through every heartbeat he felt that night. He told himself it was about stopping something before it detonated. He told himself it was about protecting the family, about finally forcing truth into the open before Adam once again manipulated the entire city into pitying him for the ruins he himself had engineered. Yet beneath all those justifications sat a more humiliating truth Nick could barely admit to himself. Adam's chaos had gotten inside him. Years of watching Adam twist pain into leverage had left Nick with a kind of infection, and now, for the first time, he was beginning to think like him. That realization should have stopped him. Instead, it pushed him further. He felt almost savage in the clarity of it. If Adam had built his life on secrecy, then secrecy would be the weapon that finally broke him. The road outside the city blurred beneath sheets of rain as Nick trailed Riza through the storm. Headlights cut through darkness in short, violent flashes. Thunder rolled overhead like distant collapse. She never saw him until it was too late. A sharp turn, a blocked lane, the sudden appearance of Nick's vehicle in front of hers, and then the entire night seemed to lose its edges. What happened next unfolded with the dreadful speed of choices that had already been made long before the moment itself. Nick stepped into the rain looking less like a man than like a verdict. Riza froze behind the wheel, not yet understanding that all the quiet observation of the past several weeks had led to this point. By the time fear fully arrived in her face, she was already trapped. The storm swallowed any sound that might have saved her. Genoa City, with all its glass towers and polished drawing rooms and carefully maintained reputations, suddenly felt impossibly far away. The house Nick took her to had once belonged to someone wealthy enough to build beauty in isolation, and then careless enough to abandon it to rot. It stood at the edge of the city like a forgotten confession, half-eaten by weather and neglect. Broken shutters hung like snapped bones. Rainwater streamed down cracked windows. The place smelled of damp wood, old dust, and the sour residue of years without human warmth. Nick dragged Riza into a room where the only light came from a single lamp casting a sickly yellow pool across the floorboards. There was no melodrama in his movements, and that made everything worse. He did not rage at her. He did not strike the walls or pace like a man losing control. He had passed that stage already. He moved with the calm of someone who believed he was owed the truth, and no longer cared what line he had to cross to claim it. Riza's panic filled the room long before she spoke. She was not simply afraid of Nick. She was afraid of the thing he claimed to know, afraid of the possibility that the secret she had been carrying was finally about to break loose in the ugliest way possible. Nick stood over her, with rain still dripping from his coat, and looked at her, not as Adam's lover or accomplice, or whatever role she thought she was playing, but as the final locked door between him and something monstrous. When he told her he knew there was a truth buried beneath her midnight calls, the room seemed to contract around them. When he told her that truth could destroy Adam completely, something changed in her face. It was small, but Nick saw it. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. That was all he needed. In his mind, that flicker confirmed everything. What made the night unbearable was not merely the fear or the confinement, but the moral ugliness rising between them. Nick had always wanted to believe that, however damaged the Newman family became, he remained the one who could still recognize the line between justice and cruelty. But that belief had started eroding long before this storm. He had watched Victor turn love into strategy. He had watched Adam turn remorse into camouflage. He had watched Sharon, Sally, Chelsea, and too many others get dragged into emotional warfare simply because the Newmans never knew how to leave pain alone. Every old wound had been training for this moment. Standing in that ruined house with Riza cornered before him, Nick could feel the last pieces of his restraint slipping. He no longer wanted truth in a noble way. He wanted it violently. He wanted Adam to hear it when he was least prepared, wanted him blindsided, wanted him to feel the floor vanish beneath him the way everyone else always did when Adam's secret surfaced too late. So Nick forced the moment into existence. He handed Riza the phone and ordered her to call Adam. He put the call on speaker not merely to gather information, but to turn the confession into theater, into punishment, into a wound delivered live. Riza's hands trembled so badly that for a moment it seemed she might drop the phone altogether. The rain battered the windows. The lamp flickered. Somewhere in the house, something loose tapped in the wind with maddening persistence. Every detail felt sharpened by dread. Nick watched her as she made the call and thought of every time Adam had acted like the broken one while leaving everyone else to absorb the damage. He thought of all the half-truths, the betrayals dressed up as survival, the manipulations done in the name of love or pain or family loyalty. This, in Nick's mind, was reckoning. When Adam answered, the change in the air was immediate. Even through the speaker, his voice carried that familiar mix of confidence and guarded instinct, but it faltered the moment he heard Riza. She did not even need to say much at first. Fear has its own language, and Adam had spent enough of his life around danger to hear it instantly. The tremor in her breathing, the strained pace of her words, the hollow space between what she said and what she actually meant, all told him that this was not an ordinary call. In that instant, whatever else Adam had been doing ceased to matter. A man who had built so much of his identity on calculation suddenly found himself responding from a far more primitive place: panic. Not loud panic, not visible panic, but the kind that freezes the blood for half a second before turning it to fire. Nick listened with a terrible stillness as Riza tried to speak around the pressure of his gaze. She was caught between two forms of danger now. The danger in the room was immediate, visible, human. The danger on the phone was larger, older, and tied to consequences that extended far beyond a single night. She began to confess, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to set the night on a path none of them could undo. She admitted there was a secret. She admitted Adam did not know everything. She admitted the person she had been contacting in the middle of the night was connected to a truth Adam had never been allowed to see. Each fractured admission landed like a blade against the fragile architecture Adam had been living inside. For Adam, the horror was not only that Riza was in danger, it was that the past he had failed to detect was suddenly reaching for him through her voice. Adam's entire life had been shaped by hidden paternity, buried motives, altered loyalties, emotional betrayals passed down like inheritance. He knew better than anyone that the deadliest truths were rarely the most obvious ones. As Riza struggled through her confession, he realized with growing dread that whatever she had hidden was not a side issue. It was central, foundational. The kind of secret that reorders relationships the moment it becomes public. His mind moved fast, mapping possibilities, rejecting some, returning to others with mounting alarm. Had she lied about who sent her? Had she been placed in his life? Was this about Victor? About a rival company? About a dead woman? About a child? About a crime? Every possibility felt catastrophic. And yet beneath Adam's strategic mind was something more personal and far more destabilizing. He cared about her. However compromised the relationship was, however much manipulation may have existed around it, hearing Riza's fear split something open in him. The old Adam might have responded with cold efficiency first and emotion later. This Adam did both at once, and that internal collision made him volatile. He began tracing the call, chasing background noise, matching storm echoes and signal drops, trying to narrow the location through instinct as much as technology. Every second that passed deepened his certainty that Nick was involved. No one else carried that particular mixture of righteousness and rage. No one else would turn a confession into an execution stage and still tell himself it was for the greater good. The emotional core of the night lay in the fact that both brothers believed they were the one finally seeing clearly. Nick believed Adam had once again placed the family in danger through secrets and seduction and selfishness. Adam believed Nick had let hatred poison him into becoming the very kind of man he had always condemned. Neither one was entirely wrong. That was what made the whole collision feel inevitable. Their war had never truly been about business or inheritance or even Victor's favor. It had always been about identity. About who got to be called damaged and still be loved, and who got forced into the role of witness, cleaner, survivor. Nick had spent years trying not to become the man his father often resembled. Adam had spent years trying to be more than the son everyone expected to fail. On this storm-soaked night, both of them were dragged backward by their oldest wounds. As Adam raced through the outskirts of Genoa City, the storm turned the roads into mirrors of fractured light. His thoughts moved in violent loops. If Riza's hidden contact was connected to Victor, then the entire thing might be a setup inside the family itself. If it was connected to someone outside the Newmans, then Adam's private life had been infiltrated more deeply than he realized. If Nick truly knew the secret and was forcing it out now, then the confession was not only about truth, it was about timing, about public ruin, about catching Adam at the moment of maximum emotional vulnerability and stripping him of every remaining defense. Adam understood that instinct because he had used versions of it himself. That recognition filled him with disgust, not just toward Nick, but toward the family machine that had trained them both to weaponize exposure. Back in the house, Riza finally reached the breaking point. Fear, exhaustion, and the unbearable strain of divided loyalties crushed whatever careful control she had been maintaining for weeks. The truth began spilling out in pieces, each one uglier than the last. She had not simply been hiding calls from Adam. She had been reporting to someone who had ties to one of the darkest chapters of his recent life. She had entered his orbit with motives that were never clean. What began as surveillance had become something more complicated, then something deeply destructive. She had discovered a piece of information about Adam that had been buried precisely because revealing it would not merely hurt him, but unravel several people at once. It was the sort of truth that made every past interaction look contaminated in retrospect. The deadliest betrayals are not those that create a new wound, but those that force someone to reinterpret every old moment through a darker lens. Nick listened as the structure of Adam's reality started collapsing through a speakerphone in real time, and instead of satisfaction, he felt something colder, not regret, not yet, but a dawning awareness that some truths, once exposed this way, do not purify anything. They simply spread damage faster. Riza's confession revealed that the stranger she had been contacting was linked to an old cover-up involving Adam's past, a cover-up that touched Victor's reach, corporate sabotage, and a personal loss Adam had never fully understood. More devastating still, it suggested that Riza had been sent not merely to observe Adam, but to steer him, to keep him emotionally unstable, to ensure certain buried facts never resurfaced. Whether she initially agreed out of fear, debt, ambition, or coercion no longer mattered to Nick in that moment. What mattered was that Adam had once again been living inside a lie sophisticated enough to mimic intimacy. The knowledge should have thrilled Nick. Instead, it left a bitter taste, because beneath his fury, he knew what this meant. Adam would not shatter quietly. He would come back from this savage, humiliated, and more dangerous than before. When Adam finally found the house, the storm was at its peak. Wind tore at the trees. Water ran in sheets down the cracked front steps. The whole property seemed to exist outside ordinary time, a place built for ruin rather than rescue. He entered with the force of someone who had abandoned every pretense of caution. In another life, perhaps the confrontation might have become physical immediately, two brothers collapsing into the oldest language they knew. But what stopped them, for one stretched and poisonous second, was the sight of each other's faces. Nick looked like a man who had crossed a line and was too proud to retreat. Adam looked like a man whose fear had transformed into something blade-like. Between them sat Riza, drenched in terror and shame, the living evidence of everything rotten that had been left to grow in darkness. The confrontation did not need spoken accusations to become explosive. The hatred in the room had years behind it. Nick's expression carried a brutal conviction that Adam was finally seeing the consequences of his own blindness. Adam's expression carried equal conviction that Nick had committed an unforgivable violation under the excuse of family protection. Riza, shattered by pressure, became less a person in that moment than the center of a moral collapse. She had lied. Nick had abducted her. Adam had failed to see what was happening in his own life. Each of them stood in a different kind of guilt, and none of them could claim innocence. That is what made the scene feel so savage. No hero had arrived. No clean truth had redeemed anyone. Nick's anger now turned jagged with disappointment, not in Adam, but in himself. He had wanted this to feel like justice. He had wanted Adam cornered, exposed, stripped of advantage. Instead, he was staring at the wreckage of his own self-image. The righteous brother had become the one using terror as leverage. The protector had become the captor. The man who despised Adam's manipulations had orchestrated one of the cruelest traps imaginable. Still, pride would not let him retreat. So he held his ground, fueled by the last remaining certainty that if he had not forced the truth out, Adam would have gone on living inside yet another lie until more lives were ruined. That belief was the only thing keeping him upright. Adam, for his part, felt two humiliations at once. The first was personal. He had been deceived by Riza, perhaps from the very beginning. The second was familial. Nick had once again assumed the right to decide what Adam should know, how he should know it, and in what emotional condition he should be left afterward. That old pattern of paternalism, of superiority disguised as concern, hit Adam almost harder than Riza's betrayal. It reopened every childhood wound, every moment in which he was treated not as an equal son, but as the family's permanent problem, the one to be managed, studied, contained. The fury that rose in him was almost unbearable because it was mixed with grief. Betrayal from a lover wounds one part of a man. Betrayal from a brother wounds the architecture beneath him. Riza's collapse forced the confrontation into a new direction. The pressure of the night, the storm, the abduction, and the confession had pushed her beyond coherence. She broke down completely, exposing not only the hidden contact and the mission behind it, but her own emotional contradictions. Somewhere along the way, whatever began as calculation had turned into real attachment, and that only made her more tragic. She had not simply manipulated Adam. She had come to care about the man she was deceiving, and that care had become its own prison. She feared the people behind the secret. She feared Adam's hatred. She feared Nick's merciless certainty. Most of all, she feared the fact that the truth, once spoken, would not only destroy Adam's illusion, but erase whatever fragile identity she had built beside him. In that sense, she was not just the keeper of the bomb. She was part of the blast radius. By dawn, nothing was solved. That was the cruelest part. The storm began to weaken, but the emotional wreckage only grew clearer in the pale light filtering through cracked windows. Nick had exposed the truth, but in doing so had committed an act that would poison his conscience long after his anger cooled. Adam had recovered Riza, but not his peace, not his trust, not any stable sense of who had been using him, and for how long. Riza had survived the night, but survival was almost meaningless now that the secret was out and every relationship around her had been contaminated. The old house stood around them like a monument to what the Newmans always did best, taking pain that might have been survivable and transforming it into legacy. The aftermath spread through Genoa City like smoke. Nothing this explosive remains private for long, especially not when it involves the Newman family. Even before details surfaced, the shift could be felt. Nick became quieter, harder to read, a man haunted by the fact that his most unforgivable act had been committed in the name of protection. Adam became colder in a way that frightened even those who thought they understood him, because humiliation had always been the one fuel he turned into revenge most efficiently. Riza disappeared into the shadows of recovery and consequence, no longer protected by secrecy yet not fully claimed by truth either. And above them all loomed the wider implication of what her confession had uncovered, that someone had engineered this deception carefully, patiently, with enough knowledge of Adam's vulnerabilities to exploit them to devastating effect. That meant the brothers' war was no longer only about what happened in the storm. It was about who set the board in motion before either of them realized they were playing. Nick now had to face the unbearable possibility that in forcing out the truth, he had served someone else's agenda. Adam had to confront the even darker possibility that the people who knew him best had once again seen him not as a son, brother, or man, but as an instrument to be destabilized when useful. The revelation poisoned everything. Every past gesture became suspect. Every alliance trembled. Every silence suddenly sounded deliberate. What made the entire story burn was that no one got the ending they thought they were fighting for. Nick did not get peace. Adam did not get clarity. Riza did not get forgiveness. Instead, all three were dragged into a deeper conflict built from exposure, wounded pride, and the old Newman curse of confusing control with love. That is where the story truly begins to sharpen. Because once a man like Nick proves he can cross a moral line, he can never again return to the innocence of believing he never would. Once a man like Adam realizes how profoundly he has been played, he stops reacting like prey and starts calculating like a survivor with nothing left to lose. And once a woman like Riza loses both secrecy and belonging in the same night, she becomes either the weakest link or the most unpredictable force in the aftermath. So the rainstorm did not end when dawn came. It only changed form. It moved out of the sky and into the Newman family itself, into offices and living rooms and private phone calls made behind locked doors, into memories reinterpreted and loyalties retested. Nick had wanted to destroy Adam with the truth. Instead, he had detonated something much larger, something that would force every character around them to choose not what they believed, but what part of themselves they were willing to lose in order to keep fighting. In Genoa City, that is always when the real damage begins.